last year was a huge year in global development. For those of you old enough to remember the movie Ben-Hur, there used to be a saying that something was the biggest since Ben-Hur. So last year in development was the biggest year since Ben-Hur, because you had the four big agendas that were set. It started with Sendai and disaster risk reduction, UN World Conference last March. It rolled on to Addis Ababa with the action agenda coming out of the International Financing for Development Conference. Then there was the SDG Agenda 2030 Summit in New York in September. And we finished the year on quite a high note in Paris with the climate change agreement. All these agendas are interlinked. And when governments take each of these global agendas, actually what they don't want is a Sendai stream, a Paris stream, a Agenda 2030 stream. All these things need to come back into national agendas and be domesticated. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I go along. But the 2030 agenda was shaped by many voices. There was really an unprecedented global conversation that went on for some 3 years leading up to the leaders gavelling the agreement through in New York last September. And Sweden was one of the very active voices, as we would expect, because of Sweden's long commitment to multilateralism and to international development cooperation. When the Secretary-General appointed his high-level panel on post-2015, the former Minister of Development Cooperation, Gunilla Carlsson, was a member of that. Sweden then became very active in the Open Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals, which the General Assembly set up, and it worked for around 18 months, probably more than 18 months to get a very big proposal on the SDGs together. But it wasn't just a question of diplomats and officials negotiating this. There were a lot of voices went into the negotiations. And those voices from Sweden included the civil society voices, the trade unions, the academia, private sector voices too. And what we were hearing from Sweden was that Sweden was advocating around incorporating the climate considerations into the agenda, climate and environment generally, gender equality and women's empowerment, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and on what became known as Goal 16 on promoting the peaceful and inclusive societies. And I understand that Sweden was also very clear about what it didn't want in the agenda and advocated successfully to ensure that the notion that a nuclear family structure was the basis for sustainable development shouldn't be included because of the diversity of families around our societies and our world. Now, the role of the UN development system with the shaping of the agenda, well, we were busy. We facilitated 88 plus national consultations in developing countries around the new agenda. And they were very broad consultations. I used to get notes on how broad they were. And I remember at one point the notes said gang members came to the consultation. Prisoners were consulted. So I felt we went out to the margins of society for feedback. But there were a lot of hubbub in the countries that did the national consultations. There were thematic consultations, global consultations, and then this huge My World survey, which is still up online, and people are still ticking the boxes about what their priorities for the global development agenda are. And across regions, it came out the top 3 were always jobs, better education, better health, but number 4 globally was better governance, honest and effective governance, which shows that there is an appreciation that the quality of governance does matter for driving development forward. So all this hubbub went into the agenda, but of course an agenda, like any agenda, is just that. It's words on paper unless something is done about it. And so this is the year when as we say colloquially in New Zealand, the rubber needs to hit the road, right? We need to get moving. It is a large and a complex agenda, and there's a lot to do. Now, we started in much tougher times than at the time the MDGs were rolled out. The global economy is sluggish, to say the least. The truth is that since the global financial crisis, a lot of major developed economies haven't really fired. And what held up global growth for years was the big emerging economies, but they're in a different space as well. India aside, which is still growing, but China has the new normal, which is slower growth, which is appropriate for the level of development it has reached. But of course it has implications for everyone selling into China, which includes the West, also includes Africa, which had the big extractive industry boom of China's demand, and that demand isn't there. So it's really a time for thinking very strategically, and for Africa, the African Union Vision 2063 and the structural transformation agenda becomes extremely important, because one cannot rely on extractive industries always having the prices that are going to see you through. And also the model of those industries often doesn't put a lot back into the society. So the structural transformations which will invest in people, diversification, inclusive and sustainable approaches becomes a very, very high priority there. Now, we're also launching at a time of rather major economic and social shifts, deepening globalization, fast technology progress. Of course, some are winners from this and some are losers. And I always think with human development, you don't want any losers. So it calls for smart public policy to see that people aren't losers from forces beyond their control. On the demographics, we have some societies aging very rapidly, but others with 2/3 of the population under the age of 26. And almost inevitably in those societies, there are big challenges in finding the jobs and livelihoods for youth. Then let's point out the obvious, that the world has many more significant violent conflicts going on at the moment. UN University says 3 times as many major civil wars as in the 1990s. And this is causing the protracted displacement crises, which are having impacts all the way to Sweden, as you know. Your media, your public discourse is always very, very mindful of this. And there are close to 60 million people out there who are forcibly displaced. And one of the issues is, are these people going to be left behind in the new agenda, which says leave no one behind? Notwithstanding all the pressures that Sweden itself is under, it has maintained a very high level of official development assistance, including through the support it gives to my own organisation, UNDP. And I can only say, we can't express how grateful we are that Sweden is looking also at the longer picture of what will it take to create a more just and peaceful and inclusive world where people will sort out their differences through talking them through and mediating them and not fighting them out. That's where Agenda 2030 is pointing us to go, and it's long-term work and not simple work, but kind of work we do. In that context, can I also say that Sweden's making a special contribution through the engagement in the International Network on Conflict and Fragility, INCAF, which was set up by OECD. And in under a month, I'll be back here in Stockholm because the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building is meeting under the co-chairpersonship of the Minister for International Development Cooperation. And support for fragile states is just so important in ensuring that Agenda 2030 and the SDGs are relevant to them as well. The last major sort of set of issues I think we face in rolling out the agenda is the scale of natural disasters now and the numbers of people impacted. And this is worsening with climate change. In fact, the World Meteorological Organization tells us to expect worsening weather for decades. And we're talking about 6 decades. And at this point, we don't actually know where the world climate warming will peak. We're told by UNEP that the commitments made in the run-up to the Paris Agreement are not good enough for a 2-degree peak, certainly not a 1.5 degree peak, that currently it might be a 2.7 degree peak. I think the World Meteorological Organization is a little more pessimistic than that. But expect worse weather for decades. And this can have a huge impact on development traction and brings us back to seeing that this disaster risk reduction agenda and the climate change adaptation and mitigation agenda are so central also to making progress on the goals. So let's come to how we're going to promote these goals. And let me start with some words of commendation to Sweden, because you are taking these goals extremely seriously at the global level and also at home. At the global level, your Prime Minister has brought together leaders from 8 other countries to be friends of SDGs and keep political momentum and will behind them. From across the regions, these leaders come. This is very important. Secondly, here in Sweden, I understand there's a national committee being established for SDG implementation, and that it will count on representation and input from beyond government across all parts of society. As well, Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Victoria is one of the prominent world citizens that the Secretary-General has appointed to his SDG advocacy group. You know, all of this, together with Sweden's strong commitment to international development cooperation, means that you are seen as an SDG champion, prepared to lead at home on implementation and to work with and inspire other countries to do what they can. And we badly need strong SDG champions like Sweden, because we need big, bold approaches and commitments to building this better world that the agenda envisages. So let's come sort of generically to what will be important in progressing the new agenda. First, and absolutely critical, is the national ownership and leadership around it. That means taking it home, as you have done in Sweden with the National Committee to be formed to progress it. Now, UNDP and our country teams of other agencies, we work in developing countries. I can tell you that as of now, more than 80 developing countries have approached their local UN country team and said, help us with this agenda, because we want to integrate it. We want it in our domestic policy plan and budget. And this is great. Right from the outset, this is happening. Even before the goals were gaveled through last year, many countries had said, we're writing our plan now. We want it in the plan. So I think this comes partly because it's a good agenda, but also because it was such a consultative process that countries feel fully part of it, and they want to be on the front foot with it. And the truth is, the MDGs, while they did a power of good, I found over the years, as I was at UNDP, there was a little more open disgruntlement with developing countries feeling that the MDGs set out a whole lot of things that they should do, and there might be a bit of Western money for it. And they feel that the SDGs, with their universal character and everybody accepting that there are things that needs to be fixed, it's a shared agenda. So it starts on a very positive tone. And the ownership comes from having been clearly part of the negotiation of it. And the feeling was a little different about the MDGs. So, secondly, to roll out the agenda, it is critical to have the whole of government approach, ideally led by prime ministers or very senior figures in a government, and to have approaches which are cross-sectoral and multi-partner. Now, why do I say this? What became clear when we started progressing the MDGs with a fast-track acceleration framework a number of years ago was that when we went into a process with countries and said, look, pick a goal you're really worried about, and let's see if we can build a multi-stakeholder platform around identifying what's holding it up and why you're not making progress. And I can assure you that nothing was ever held up because there wasn't a strategy. There was always a strategy. There was always a policy. There was always a plan, but it ran into a brick wall. And maternal mortality was one of the classics. It was the goal, one of the goals that did the worst in the MDGs. And when countries picked that goal and we went into UN convening, government, a whole range of stakeholders to look at what is the problem here. With maternal mortality, one of the first things that's very obvious is that where you have a lot of forced marriage of girls and girls having babies very early, the maternal death rate is higher. It's almost a no-brainer. So in order to seriously impact on maternal death rate, we need our girls in school. We need our girls being able to make their own decisions about their lives and their choices. So that sort of takes you into an area of activity that you wouldn't necessarily see from a narrow health action perspective. As well, transport becomes a big factor. You know, that you may have the services, but can people access them? Can they get there? Can they afford the transport? Is the transport even available if you're living literally beyond the end of the road. So a lot of other issues come up. Now, I think the experience we had with the MDG acceleration and these multi-sector approaches is so appropriate to the SDGs, which start from the basis that everything here is interlinked, that if you're going to push hard on one point, you're going to have positive flow over impacts for others. And when we sort of revamp the way we work on acceleration, I think it will be very consciously looking at what would give the greatest catalytic impact across a range of goals. And you might then focus on issues like energy, sustainable energy for all, whereas if you can get that right, it has major social benefits, major economic benefits, and of course benefits for the local environment and as well. So it leads me to the third point, broad coalitions being needed to progress the SDGs. The government commitment and leadership is vital, but it's not enough on its own. You know, the whole orchestra has to play, and that let's first mention parliaments and civil society needing to be involved in meaningful ways. I know in Sweden there's been very strong engagement by parliament, civil society, media, and the role is not just one of monitoring and holding governments to account. Civil society also very much wants to be part of determining the strategy and part of the action as well. So here in Sweden, I understand Concord Sweden coordinated the voice and advocacy of many of the CSOs, civil society organisations, in the whole sort of development process of the new agenda, and it will continue to be active. The civil society will be active. I think this is very positive, and thank you also UNA Sweden for being a platform for really promoting awareness and action on the SDGs. On the private sector, we see a lot of private sector interest across the Nordic countries in linking with the agenda in many different ways. Many are looking at it, how it applies to their business model, for example, both at home and abroad. I think, you know, the progressive business leaders see that the future lies in broad-based and sustainable development. And without question, how and where business does business has a huge impact on whether this agenda will be achieved. Opening up value chains to micro-business and SMEs, offering decent work, and operating in eco-friendly ways are all very important contributions the private sector can make, and many are already working in these ways. And let me just give one example we saw, which was last year. H&M, which I understand is a Swedish company, signed a global framework agreement to strengthen trade union rights for all H&M workers throughout their supply chain. The agreement will cover and secure the rights of 1.6 million garment workers in 1,900 factories. Now that's incredible leadership, because what do we think when we think of garment factories? We think of a deadly fire in Dakar. Now, this is a sector with a lot of exploitation. So to have a major company like this say, not on our watch, this is very significant, and I hope it will have others follow in its wake. Fourth point on what will progress the agenda, finance. Look, money isn't everything, but it does help. It does help. But there's not enough in the public purse. There's not enough in the donor purse. There's not enough in government purses. So we have to be part of mobilising the money. Growing economies, ability to collect taxes, attract investment, trade, all sources are important in this agenda. And then my fifth point would be that progressing the agenda is very much about sharing ideas, technologies, innovation, experience, including through South-South cooperation, which is a fast-growing part of development cooperation. Look, there's so much more one can say, but I want to bring the comments to a close. I can talk a little more on if people are interested in the question time, about the way the UN system is approaching the agenda. We do have a joined-up approach across all the agencies, which is very important, because we can't exhort governments to take a whole of government approach if we all rush off in silos to different ministries. So we have a joined-up approach. We're very enthusiastic about the agenda. We know the world has many challenges, but we actually think that if everyone would come on board with progressing an agenda like this, with the goals like this, we actually could build a much better world. And I think that's what brings everyone to a seminar like this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen Clark. Now, if I may please just follow up with a question. From a UNDP point of view, what are the most important needs in actually making the UN development system fit for purpose for the new Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, one of the calls on the system from the member states has been to be much more joined up and collaborative in the way it works. And that has been a challenge coming from where the system came from. Bear in mind the agencies in the UN development system come from many different traditions. The ILO was formed when the League of Nations was formed. Others, like the International Telecommunications Union, were formed in the mid-19th century. So you have very, very strong traditions and silos in agencies. But the point is, it is what it is, and you try to bring it together around a common cause. This is what the member states expect. And they expect UNDP, as the lead and coordinating agency in the system, to drive this. And we do, and we have many willing friends among the agencies in that. So in becoming fit for purpose, after the last 4-yearly General Assembly comprehensive policy review of the system, because this happens every 4 years, it's happening again this year, we drew up new procedures for all the country teams around the world. Now, there was previously a pilot called Delivering as One, but Delivering as One required a government to ask the country team to work together. Well, why would you wait to be asked? We want value for money, we want coherence. So the new procedures that are rolled out now in every country team are different about the way the team works. And it's not an option whether you work together. You must work collaboratively. And just at the headline level, every country with the UN country team has a UN development assistance framework with the government. These used to be all over the place. So now the guidelines bring them down to being very strategic, a limited number of outcome areas, and then for each outcome area, and we really only like 3 or 4 or 5 of these, you form a results group. You put an agency in the lead, and those who can contribute to supporting development results in that area play in that group, right? They contribute to it, and they contribute to the results we expect and can be measured and evaluated. So we've tightened all that up. And then we go into this era with the MDGs, with that way of working, supporting the joint approach on the rollout. And the joint approach is around supporting the mainstreaming of the agenda into the domestic policies, plans and budgets, the acceleration of progress, and we are revamping the tool from the MDG era to be fully appropriate to SDGs. And then on the policy support, we want joined up policy support, because when you go into an agenda like this, it's essentially telling you that an economic policy which exacerbates inequalities and marginalisation and wrecks the environment isn't the way you want to go. So you have to have much more joined up thinking. And that really, all our agencies need to come together around that joined up thinking and not stay in silos. So that we are working very hard on being fit for purpose to be relevant to the agenda.